All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today, returning to the show for, I believe, the third time, is Dr. James McGrath. He is the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University. He's the author of numerous books, and he recently contributed in a chapter to a book called Judeophobia and Contemporary Culture, where he talks about the ways that people kind of misunderstand Judaism in the modern world. And really, I want to have him on here to discuss that contribution, but we're also going to talk today just about the many ways that the church has over the years misunderstood Judaism and the context of early Christianity. And I really hope to clear up a lot of issues related to that. So Dr. McGrath, I'm really excited to talk to you about this today.
Yeah, pleasure to be back. I lost track of how many times. I just knew that every time we'd had a conversation, it's been a pleasure. So I'm always happy to come back and have another one.
Well, I was looking at it. It didn't seem like it was that long ago, but time goes by so fast. It's been almost a year and a half since the last time I had you on the show. For my new listeners, go ahead and introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah. So as Alex said, I'm the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University, but have also branched out into a number of side areas, some only maybe a step or two away from New Testament and some further afield. And so I've done work on John the Baptist, who is a New Testament figure, but looking at him as a historical figure, but also on a group known as the Mandaeans, who hold John in high esteem and view him as a prophet in their tradition. And then I've also written things on like Star Wars and Star Trek and Doctor Who. And it's interesting that in the Judeophobia in the New Testament volume, what I was actually sort of tasked with doing as a contribution to that, and I think this may have been my own choice, I can't remember. I remember there being some conversation with the editors, and there were some actual New Testament texts that I thought, oh, might like to do that, but they also wanted one on how the New Testament comes up in popular culture. And so I was like, oh, I could totally do that. And so that's why I ended up contributing to that volume.
And I want to ask you about the term Judeophobia. So the language that people usually use to describe kind of maybe an antipathy or maybe like a concern about Jewish identity is anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. What is Judeophobia, and how might that be a little more precise than those other terms?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not sure that any of these terms are. They're only as precise as the way we use them, right?
Right.
I think the thing is that anti-Semitism has, on the one hand, become just maybe almost overly familiar, right? And so it's possible to sort of almost breeze by it. And the terminology of Islamophobia, homophobia, these types of newer ways of talking about the ways that people react. I think one of the things, the phobia element, a phobia is when we have something usually that's more than just or maybe not even a sort of a reasoned reaction to something. We have an instinctive gut reaction that usually, if we call it a phobia, it goes beyond anything that one could justify sort of reasonably and logically. If you have arachnophobia, or my wife is terribly afraid of snakes, and her reaction is not just, oh, this is something that's dangerous, I think I will walk away. There's screaming and other things. Right. And I used to be, really have quite an aversion to wasps, just so it's not that I'm throwing my wife under the bus. But I think the thing that's helpful is that it highlights that this is not just discrimination. It's not something where somebody has investigated. It's certainly not talking about something where somebody has investigated a religion and disagrees with it on principle. I mean, you can do that and not be anti-Jewish or anti-Christian or anti-atheist or anti-anything or anti-Islamic. It's about reactions that people have picked up. They're shaped probably just as other types of phobias are, prior to the time when we really have clear memories as to why we hold these views, right? And so I think that's what makes the term useful. But I've been seeing a lot of posts on social media where people are saying, "Oh, Islamophobia is just a made-up term." It's like all terms are made up,
right?
It doesn't mean that there isn't something here that we should talk about or we should think about. And so hopefully the term will, if the term serves that purpose and gets people thinking about discrimination and instinctive reactions, negative reactions that they have to other traditions, other cultures, other ideologies, other religions, whatever, then it will be as useful as that proves to be.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, I know social media is not real life, but it does not take long to be on social media to realize that, whatever we make of the term Judeophobia, there are a lot of people out there that have that. And there are even a lot of biases that are built into otherwise well-meaning people in the church that just don't really understand what to do with Judaism. And so there's obviously a lot going on in contemporary culture with respect to Judeophobia. So why write about it and talk about it? Why is it so important to try to analyze what's going on in our contemporary culture with respect to Judeophobia?
Yeah, so I think the reason why, not just a book on this subject in sort of in general, which could be very useful, but one that's really focused on Judeophobia and the New Testament, right? It's not just sort of in the New Testament, but and the New Testament, right? There are texts in the New Testament that seem to have a negative view of Judaism, and in their original context, and taking consideration who the authors are likely to be and things like that, in a lot of instances that seems like it's probably not what they could possibly mean, because these authors are themselves Jewish, right?
Yeah.
And so one can hold a negative view of one's own tradition, and it means something different, and it functions differently than if you are an outsider, and then functions differently again if you are a powerful other, right? Maybe the one who sort of wields power to society. And so as Christianity undergoes this process of emerging from its Jewish context, right? Initially, can't talk about Christianity as something that is separate from Judaism. And for a while, it doesn't even have a clear name. It's just this messianic movement that's focused on Jesus within a Jewish context. But as it emerges and becomes something different, right, there's tension, hostility, and that happens as, whenever religious groups splinter and separate. It's happened all throughout the history of Christian denominations as well. But sometimes you have power aligned with a group, and sometimes it's a group that used to be, the minority and subject of discrimination. So what happens is that the church becomes this powerful entity closely tied with political power in certain parts of the world. And yet within these sacred texts are statements about the Jews, right, and Judaism and things like that, which now in that context and within that setting have a very different meaning and connotation. And historically, they've become the basis for demonization, discrimination. There have been pogroms, and of course, the Holocaust. Definitely don't want to say that the Nazis represent anything that would be categorized as sort of mainstream Christianity or anything like that. But the context of Christian Judeophobia or anti-Semitism or whatever one wants to call it in Germany, in Europe, provided a context in which some really horrible atrocities could happen. And there are obviously lots of ways in which this is relevant, but particularly at the intersection of the New Testament and the status of these writings as sacred texts, not just for people who are happy to perpetuate those discriminations, but also those who strongly don't want to, but then may not know, well, then what do I do with these texts? What do they mean? How can they be understood in some other way than the way I've always assumed? Providing some scholarship that will offer some guidance and some suggestions on how to navigate that, I think can be really useful and does something really important.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that you give, and as you already alluded to this, you give several examples in your chapter of ways in which Judeophobia manifests itself in unintentional ways in American pop culture. One, like my daughter's a huge Harry Potter fan, and I think you mentioned like the and I should know this better. Whatever, there's like, it's like the bankers are kind of like negatively portrayed and like typically Jewish stereotypes, and there are several examples like that where people might not intend to do it, but it just kind of seeps into the culture. So talk about some examples of where we see Judeophobia in the modern world, even maybe in unintended places.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have an array in there. It was interesting. I got some pushback on some of the things I said about Ghostbusters. So I'll steer clear of that example. But Doctor Who had an episode, right, that was, what was it called? The Witchfinders, and has the Doctor and companions arriving in the time of King James, and King James appears as a character in this episode, right? And I mean, one reason I love this show is that you can do all these kinds of interesting things with time travel and religion. Yeah, and it potentially can be a lot of fun. But there's this character who says, you shall not suffer a witch to live, right? As King James, as says in King James's New Bible. And the doctor responds by saying, well, there's a sequel, and it says, love your neighbor, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And that's a very common Christian response. It's a very common cultural response to think about, sort of the sort of the so-called angry God of the Old Testament versus the loving God of the New Testament, these kinds of things. And this is something that Christianity has wrestled with for a very, very long time, almost since the beginning. But the irony in that particular example, of course, is that although Jesus highlighted loving one's neighbor, that's a quote from Leviticus, right? And when the doctor said there's a sequel, was not referring to Leviticus as a sequel to the laws, right? It's thinking about the New Testament as a sequel. And so it's playing into that assumption and those assumptions about how Christianity relates to Judaism, talking in ways that might even pose them as at odds with one another. And yet the scriptures that are being referred to there, including you shall not suffer a witch to live, were the scriptures of the earliest Christians, the scriptures of Jesus, right? And so I still am a Doctor Who fan, just for the record.
Right.
But
Right.
Examples like this show how easy it is to throw away these comments that are just historically problematic, but also pose either posit a dichotomy or treat two things as antithetical, when in fact the relationship is much different and much more nuanced, or at least should be.
Yeah. Well, and I really want to spend the majority of this episode talking about how we got here, because from my vantage point, there are kind of two mistakes that people make with Judaism. One of them is within the church, and I know that you're very familiar with this too. I've had this conversation with 1,000 people where you bring up like, oh yeah, Jesus was a Jew or Paul was a Jew, and they kind of sit and think about it for a minute and they're like, oh yeah, well, I guess they kind of were. But it's like, it's so obvious when you read the text that like they're writing within a Jewish context, and that should influence the way that we read the New Testament. But there's such a disconnect between Judaism as a form of religion and Christianity in the minds of so many modern Christians that it makes it easy for people to just kind of to the extent where like some very conservative Christians will say, well, Judaism is just a false religion altogether. And then on the flip side, you have the kind of the people that are out there in the cultural sphere, and a lot of these guys have a particular like political bent or whatever, but they'll say like the Jews run the world, they have a disproportionate impact on the media and in academia and all of that kind of stuff. And that also seems to be a gross characterization and distortion of Judaism. But we're here and we had to get there somewhere. So the first question I want to ask you about this, I know it's like a massive question. And we only have time to touch on it briefly, but like, how do we get from a Jewish Jesus and a Jewish Paul talking about the Jewish Messiah Jesus to the Middle Ages, where pretty much everybody rejected Judaism and Jews as second-class citizens in Europe?
Yeah. This is why I think that making analogies with things where, on the one hand, it's maybe a bit more familiar. Not that sort of this process shouldn't be familiar to people who read the New Testament, but right. Not used to thinking of it in terms of sort of the dynamics of religious, what we might call sectarianism, and the formation of new religious movements, and so on and so forth. And so you think about something like Methodism, right? To take an example that depending on who's listening, could be very controversial, but the Wesleys did not see themselves as founders of a new religious movement, right? And so talking about John and Charles Wesley as Methodists is somewhat anachronistic, and we want to put them in their time. We want to talk about them as Anglican, right? We want to talk about them within the context of the church, tradition into which they were born and within which and like Luther, right, in the context of Catholicism, although in his case, there's a much stronger, the sort of the power dynamics and the way things play out are at least somewhat different. And so these things don't always unfold the same way, but most new religious movements, I think, but certainly many of them, right? Because I haven't counted all of them to know whether most might be inaccurate. So let me catch myself there. But it's very, very common for this to come about as a result of somebody trying to do what they think is reform their own tradition, right? They say, well, we need more of this, or why don't we go back to doing it this way, or why don't we try this new thing, or if we, that group over there is doing this thing, and maybe we should listen to them and we can learn something from them without abandoning our own belief. Or there are any number of different ways that people try to go about reformation. And the key thing is that it's not inevitable that that becomes a new religious movement, right? And yet it happens very, very often, right? Because it's very, very common. It's not always the case that the parent tradition remains the dominant religion, and this new thing becomes this small thing. Sometimes this breakaway becomes something very, very big in its own right, and sometimes the original tradition dwindles. Both can become competitors, in which case you can have a lot of engagement, oftentimes with a lot of polemic. And so there's no inevitability about how these things unfold. And it wasn't inevitable that Christianity would become this predominantly Gentile religious movement, and Judaism would become something that's defined over against this. What became Christianity, the Jesus form of Judaism, or however we might want to phrase that, seems to have been quite popular in its time, right? And if it had not been for, on the one hand, a decisive reaction against that popularity, on the other hand, an openness to including Gentiles and that really taking off, right? None of that was inevitable. And so the fact that we have a predominantly Gentile Christianity as a world religion and Judaism as something that is almost entirely, not doing the Jesus thing, or however one wants to put it, this whole situation could have, our current situation could have been very different, right, if just a few moments in history had unfolded somewhat differently.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about like the theological consequences of that, because it is, and especially, I mean, for people that are like in the world of biblical scholarship and that have read all of it, like it's just impossible for me to read the Bible outside of its Jewish my brain doesn't even work that way, but most people don't do it that way. So you and I know, that Jesus is a Jew, John is a Jew, Peter's a Jew, Paul's a Jew. They're all Jewish figures, but most Christians don't read the Bible that way at all. And so I want to talk about like the impact that has on Christian theology. Like, in what ways does that distort our ability to kind of accurately get anything out of the New Testament?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, part of it is just that I think there's a tendency, when maybe this is the main one that, because there are lots of possible answers to that question.
Right. Yeah.
We could spend a lot of time exploring, and I'm happy to get into some of the other ones. But one is just the fact that we tend to read these texts from the past that are part of our scripture as though what people were doing was always what we're doing, right? And so on the one hand, if one thinks that the true religion is Christianity, then you'll have people who will read the text and will assume that, either that, basically Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, they're basically Christians, or that, what they may say is that, okay, technically there were, Israelites, or there were Hebrews, or there were whatever else, but they were basically doing what we're doing today. And then the reason why sort of Jesus came along was because they'd gotten away from that thing that they were doing. And so Jesus was trying to bring them back, and then they rejected that. And so now we're doing the right thing, and what's left in sort of Judaism is people who are doing this wrong thing. But that wasn't what, David and Solomon or Hezekiah or Josiah or whoever you want to choose were doing, right? And in fact, ancient Israelite religion, even if there are things from that, the prophets have a big influence on Christianity, right? And so it's not as though there's not a connection, but ancient Israelite religion had animal sacrifice as a major component. And when I talk about the temple, it's very common for students to instinctively substitute the church, right? Like, and think of it as a church building. It's like a cathedral or something like that. And for them to envisage that worship meant something very, very different to ancient people. That, and to think that the early Christians, some of them are described as going to the temple and being part of this thing, and say, wait, was that just a mistake, or is that just a holdover? No, this was just how things were. And had it not been for the destruction of the temple in the year 70, a theology that formulates a way of interacting with God without the need for that sort of edifice, may not have become the dominant. Again, things might have unfolded differently.
Yeah.
And so I think the most important thing is that when we read these texts and assume that everybody who's doing the right thing is doing what I'm doing, then they lose some of their power to challenge us across time and space, right? When we realize that people were relating to God and were expressing their faith in these ways that seem really foreign and alien to us and to our modern sensibilities, then we can assume that our way of doing things is the default. It's obvious. This is how it should be. And so that one of the things that does is it not only leads us to distort these texts when we read them, but it primes us to resist changes that might be sort of the things, the process, the tradition continuing into the future and adapting in ways that it needs to, right? For, let's say, the post-COVID internet era, or whatever else we might want to say, right? There's a process that leads from there to where we are, and it's not necessarily one of they were wrong, we were right. And realizing that helps us realize that someone who comes along later and maybe wants to reform, they don't necessarily have to start yet another new religious movement.
Right.
Maybe we can be open to some reformation every now and again, and to some rethinking of how we do things.
Yeah. Well, and it seems to me like, a really egregious example of this is just the way that the writers of the New Testament, Paul in particular, but then also like Luke and Acts, talk about the incorporation of Gentiles. So like I remember growing up, like the question is, well, how do we convince Jewish people to become Christians? But the way it's framed in the New Testament, like Acts 15 and Galatians 3, and then like Romans 11 is a great example of this. It's like, it's not how do Jews become Christians? It's how are Gentiles incorporated into the family of Abraham? It's like we've almost got it exactly backwards because we just assume that like the Jews are on the outside by default, and that's not the way that like Paul would have looked at it.
Yeah, and I think it was fascinating, to be talking about this at a conference. So there is a perspective, a movement within New Testament scholarship, and sometimes it's called the within Judaism approach. Like, so viewing Paul as a figure within Judaism, like recognizing that however much he's either pushing at boundaries and he's doing some things that are unconventional, he's still working within the context of Judaism. That's how he understands himself. And even if he's trying to reshape it and redefine it, he's doing it as a Jew among other Jews in relation to a heritage that is his own, and into which he's trying to welcome others, right? And so I think, it was fascinating in that context to just start thinking about some texts that are very familiar to me, and yet actually in the process of engaging with this conversation, just thinking about them a little bit differently than I ever had before, right? So thinking about the fact that when there's this discussion of like what is going to be required, what stipulations from the Torah and from tradition are going to be expected from what we might call Gentile Christians, right? This discussion in Acts 15, right? Sometimes described as the first church council. The Gentile Christians are not asked, right? I mean, this is basically what are the terms of Gentile?
That's a great point.
Gentiles finally surrendering to the God of Israel and recognizing the superiority of the God of Israel, right? And I never thought of there being sort of a nationalistic, sort of framework and element to this. That it's like we're welcoming the Gentiles, but these are the terms of surrender, right? Essentially, right?
That's a great way of putting it.
Resisting the one true God all this time and going astray, and now we're going to, we're opening the doors and giving you a chance to come in, and here's here are the stipulations. And I think we need, on the one hand, we need to read these texts that way and recognize that these are the kinds of things that may have been happening then, and yet we also need to figure out what to do, because no matter how much we engage in careful historical reading of these texts, in our own time, Judaism is this world religion and Christianity is this world religion, and within each there's a fair amount of diversity. And just reading texts in an accurate way historically, that's just one small piece of the puzzle of how do we relate to those who have different viewpoints on religion today.
Yeah. Well, and I want to circle back to the Bible because I got a couple of questions about the way that this has worked in biblical scholarship over the last 50 years or so. But just in the way that and you bring this up in your chapter, but just in the way that the New Testament is framed as superior to the Old, and this is what you were talking about when you were discussing Doctor Who and the way that they talked about the New Testament being the sequel. So I grew up, like my formative years I spent in the Lutheran church, right? And so going through confirmation, I learned all about Martin Luther, and it's like this giant dichotomy between law and gospel, and the Old Testament, that was then, and the New Testament, this is now. And there's just this very hard division within the Lutheran tradition between the Old Testament and the New Testament, with the logical conclusion that the New Testament is superior to the Old. And I think that even for a lot of Christians that don't come out of the Lutheran tradition, that's just kind of the way that we look at it. Like the Old Testament's like, it's important, it's the Bible kind of, but it's like, it's not relevant in the same way that the New Testament is, because the Old Testament's all about that sacrifice and that law and all that bad stuff. And the New Testament's all about grace and love and the God and all of that good stuff. Now, I must confess, it wasn't until I think my sophomore year, maybe I think it was the first semester of my sophomore year in college, where I actually sat down and read through the prophets for the first time. And that completely wrecked that dichotomy for me. Like actually hearing what the prophets had to say, I was like, well, I don't think that this hard split between the Old and the New Testament actually makes sense. And it didn't. But I want to get your comments on that. So like, where is it just like kind of what you were saying earlier? The Christian tradition's always kind of been in that it's always kind of gone in that direction, and there's this split between Jew, and we've just kind of imposed that on the Bible. Like, how does that work? The conceptualization of the Old and New Testament, and how does that contribute to like Judeophobia and just this chronic misunderstanding of Judaism by modern Christians?
Well, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
But just to start digging into it, and then we'll see where the conversation goes. And so if I miss out something, feel free to circle back and say, oh, what about this aspect of it? Or, you didn't really talk about such and such. So one major strand in New Testament scholarship in the 20th century, and my doctoral supervisor, James Dunn, was one of the people who was actively involved in this, came to be known as the New Perspective on Paul. And it really involved a recognition that the ancient Jewish sources that we have are not, don't as closely resemble the 16th century Catholicism that Luther was arguing against as Luther assumed, right? And so in interpreting what Paul says about faith and works, Luther was engaging with some things that were going on in his own time and read the controversies, having essentially one side of them, right, in Paul's letters, read them through that lens. And what E.P. Sanders did, through his work on Judaism, but then James Dunn and N.T. Wright and others did by rethinking Paul and suggesting that Sanders, sort of had made some important points about Judaism, but hadn't rethought Paul and what Paul was saying, quite far enough, is to suggest that what's really going on is less about what we might call works righteousness, trying to earn your way to heaven, earn your salvation, something like that, and is much more about things like sort of national identity and privilege, election, believing that we are the ones who possess the truth, right? We've been chosen by God, and so even if we mess up, we have forgiveness because God has chosen us. Whereas others who are outside of this people group are barely have a chance, even if they try their hardest and do everything right, because they're just not have that elect status. And one of the things that strikes you, if you ponder that for a while, is that there's a lot of Christianity that sounds a lot like that, right? It sounds like it's arguing not for what Paul, from that perspective, was saying, but almost the opposite, right? If you're a Christian, then you have forgiveness, and it doesn't matter how much you screw up. And other people who are seeking God with their whole heart, but they didn't believe, they didn't say the sinner's prayer, or whatever else, and so they're and it's interesting to realize that a tradition, at least in theory, may have, right, and we'd have to discuss a lot of the evidence before probably your listeners would be persuaded that, but it's possible for a movement to end up looking like the opposite of what it was stood for at some point in the past, right? And that's happened with lots of religions and parties, ideologies of all sorts. It's unimaginable probably in most historical moments, but it has happened and continues to happen. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, and mention as a recommendation, for those who are interested, Amy Jill Levine is one of a relatively small handful of New Testament scholars and scholars of early Christianity who are themselves Jewish, right? And that lends a really interesting and quite distinctive perspective. And knowing her and having engaged with her about some of what I've written, what she's written, and being sort of academic friends in that way, she's given some I think deserved pushback against some of what well-meaning New Testament scholars, including myself, have sometimes tried to do. Because on the one hand, you can say Paul is just trying to have this vision for Judaism or vision for the people of God that's not ethnocentric. And if you are part of a global minority tradition such as Judaism, your reaction might be, why can't we be ethnocentric? Why can't we protect our heritage, right? That's what we've been good at, right? We've made these boundaries and we've had these customs of food and other things that have helped us preserve this heritage. And we don't want to just let everybody in. And when you open up, I mean, if you've ever had the experience of an influx of people from a different culture or some other, some very different background coming into a community, it changes things, right? Conversion does transform, right? And so I appreciated that she articulated this. It's like, as long as you're going to assume that okay, the only good way of being Jewish is Paul's way of being Jewish, then you haven't really addressed sort of the heart of the problem, right?
Yeah.
And so I appreciate that she's, and I'm not sure that I've done justice to that. So if not, hopefully someone will draw this to our attention, and she'll come on your show and put it in her own characteristically better way. But I think the point is that Paul was doing something, Jesus was doing something, all of these figures were doing something where they did not, as far as we can tell, did not understand themselves to be starting something completely new, but doing something different as an expression of their own heritage. And even when they were innovating, right, oftentimes they at least thought of themselves as getting back to the prophets, right, who put less emphasis on sacrifice and more on justice and things like that. And so I think that's the crucial thing that all of these different approaches and these different sort of movements in New Testament scholarship have in common, which is to recognize that even when they're doing things that eventually ultimately lead to at least some forms of what we now call Christianity, I guess it's a question of how much do you interpret and judge and evaluate the earliest stage of something based on where it ends up.
Right.
And how, and on the one hand, if something sort of causes a rupture, then, maybe we should take seriously that, okay, this is the kind of thing was happening that causes ruptures. It's hard to know. And it seems almost inevitable that we're going to be anachronistic, that we're going to read our own perspectives and all this later history into things. And on the one hand, that does some distortion, but on the other hand, what that distorts in terms of how we understand the New Testament, as we've already seen, in our conversation today, can perpetuate, some of the sort of negative, sort of discriminatory views of religious others.
Yeah, I did. And I know that some of my listeners are going to be very interested in this. Some of them might not be, but this is a purely selfish intellectual question. You studied, as you said, you studied under James Dunn, which is incredible. And when I was working through my degree in biblical studies, this was like the heyday of the new perspective on Paul. So I read a ton of James Dunn. I read a ton of N.T. Wright, very convinced by their approach. And then it was, Magnus Zetterholm published a book called Approaches to Paul, where he talked about the different camps within Pauline studies. And he had a section in there on what he called, I think, the radical new perspective at that time. And so from there, I learned about the work of Martin Anos and read some of that. And I was like, oh, this is pretty convincing. And over the last couple of years, Thiessen has come out with his book, A Jewish Paul, and then I just finished a couple weeks ago Matthew Novinson's book, Paul and Judaism at the End of History. And I'm pretty much convinced that that like the radical new perspective or the Paul then Judaism school is correct. I wanted to get your thoughts on that though, real quick. Like, what do you think about the divide between the new perspective and the radical new perspective, and how, in your own view, how, like, I don't know, how Jewish is Paul is not the right question to ask, but like, how should we see Paul's relation to Judaism?
Yeah, and there's a real sense in which there's really almost no point in you discussing this with me, because I've stuck very much with the Gospels thing, and so
right.
I'm watching what's happening in Pauline studies much the way you are, sort of as like it's like trying to stay abreast of it, but it's not where I'm, and so just to say that I don't know that I have, other than being present in sessions where this gets discussed maybe more often than you get the chance to, just by virtue of what I do. But it's not the thing that I've spent most of my time on of late, and so I don't feel like I know it as intimately as I would love to. And I need to find a topic. This is just an aside that will get me to spend time on Paul. Right? Scholars, usually eventually get there. If you do Paul, you eventually do the Gospels thing, and vice versa. But my impression is that it really is just all of this. Each of these phases is just an attempt to get the nuances right, and figure out how do we just avoid, even in the very way that we approach this, right? Like saying, Paul and Judaism, it was, E.P. Sanders, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. It's still, even in the very title, it sounds like Paul stands over against Palestinian Judaism, right? And so how do we, how do we find terminology that does justice to this when, in fact, we're standing, in a framework in which there's almost any words that we use have different meanings than they had then, right? The possibility of being Jewish and Christian at the same time, or being a Jesus follower who is Jewish, we can use that language, but in our day and age, that means something different. It's like art. So is that like Jews for Jesus? Is this, one of these Gentile Christians who really likes, like does like a Christian Seder at Passover or something like that, and all these other things that are, each of which we could talk about. And so there are Christians who are, have rediscovered an appreciation for things that are Jewish, and yet are still very much, appreciating them within the framework of, and gosh, wouldn't it be great if all these people eventually convert to Christianity, essentially. And it's almost, a sort of a stepping stone, a mechanism for doing that. And the question of how to be religious, how to be Christian, how to maybe even think that, as a Christian, you have something that you want to share with others who may not have your background, and to do that in a context of awareness that Christianity was an influence that, however much you might want to distance yourself from it, historically was implicit in efforts that could have exterminated Judaism, right? And certainly tried in moments. And so all of that is the baggage that we bring, right? And that's why you get, it's like the new perspective, radical. How do we talk about those earlier moments in history when none of that's happened yet? And most of us would say it's not inevitable that would eventually happen. And yet we're talking about the start of a process that eventually leads there. How do we talk about it? How do we get the history right? And what words do we need to do? What categories, what frameworks do we need to do or to bring into the picture and to utilize in order to talk about this in a way that doesn't distort, without us at least being aware that we're distorting and being aware of the impact that our contemporary lenses and our historical baggage bring. I'm not sure if it's helpful. But.
Yeah, no, that really was. And I guess you see that same dynamic in gospel studies as well. Like whether it's like, and I know the quests are all artificial and everything, but like with the third quest, it really was, I think, a greater awareness of the Jewishness of Jesus. And then I interviewed several scholars that contributed to the next quest book that was published. Crossley and Chris Keith were the two that were responsible for editing that. But I had Adele Reinhardt's on the show. She has an excellent chapter on the Jewishness of Jesus, where she just says, Jesus is a Jew, full stop. stop. All historical Jesus research needs to be conducted under that assumption. And I think she's absolutely right. But I guess that, that raises that raises again the problem of like these concepts are all so difficult to work with, and there's a lot of unlearning that people have to do. And I guess I want to get your perspective on like to what extent when we're reading the Bible, to what extent are the labels Jew and Christian? I mean, I think Jew is obviously more important, but let me put it this way, I guess. To what extent are the labels Judaism and Christianity as discrete systems of religion even helpful for thinking about the New Testament? Or are they more of a hindrance?
Yeah, I think there's a large extent to which they are a hindrance. I mean, the term Christian, readers are often blown away by the fact that Paul doesn't use this term, right?
Yeah.
It's like, we're that early in the process that, there isn't even a label, and some of the labels that get used, like the way, I think, that's one I think may go back to John the Baptist, given his imagery, the importance in his movement of, the imagery of the way in the wilderness and things like that. And of course, thinking of Christianity as, and Jesus as connected to an earlier movement, sort of prior to Jesus, that in itself, working on John the Baptist as a figure in history, I think I found very helpful in terms of thinking about this as something that doesn't start with Jesus in a sense, right? I mean, when Luke starts his gospel, he says, I'm going to tell you about these important events that happened. Here's Zechariah and Elizabeth, right? The beginning of the good news, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, John in the wilderness proclaiming, it's each of these gospels is aware that when Jesus comes into the picture, it's not a radical break from what was there before. And so I think that something like that, I am biased, having spent so much time thinking about John the Baptist lately, but I do think that noticing things like that also can be relevant. And so Christianity, recognizing that we're dealing with a movement and maybe leaving that label out of the picture can be helpful. But Judaism is another one that's fraught, because for us today, it is sort of an ethnicity and a religion, and they overlap. And sometimes when teaching, we'll talk about the examples of how this question of, what does it mean to be Jewish? Who is a Jew? Have come up in the modern day, right? I think early in the history of the modern nation of Israel, there was someone who applied for citizenship on the basis of the fact that he was, Jewish ancestry, showing his maternal line, but he was a Christian monk, right? And so they were like, okay,
yeah.
Is it enough to have the lineage, right? You also need the religious faith. But there are lots of Jewish atheists today, and that somehow seems less. It tells us something about the baggage and the history and the tensions that seems less self-contradictory. I mean, it still seems problematic to many Jews as well as many atheists and many others, but it somehow seems less self-contradictory than talking about a Jewish Christian.
Yeah.
And so talking about what's going on, recognizing that in the first century, the term that we tend to translate as Jewish also could be rendered Judean, right? That when you have people who are associated with this religion, they're aware that it's a religion of a particular people group who have a connection with a particular place where there is a temple that is thought of as the place where one worships, and the sole place where one offers sacrifice to the one true God and things like that. And on the other hand, recognizing that being Judean is just a subset of the story of the people of Israel, right? And the children of Abraham and things like that. And so things like that are a major focus in the New Testament. And precisely because we tend to think in terms of Jewish and Christian, there have only been a handful of scholars who've really said, okay, so what did it mean if you said Israelite rather than Jewish? And were people like John the Baptist and Jesus, were they trying to be inclusive of a broader definition of Israel? And how did that relate to Samaritans, who were at least sometimes viewed as remnants of the northern tribes, but sometimes viewed as basically having distorted it and intermingled it to such an extent that there was nothing recoverable there? Because the terminology of Israel, right, comes in the New Testament, and that too seems to be a feature, particularly in contexts in which you have this, some of the more negative statements about Judaism, right? Oftentimes it seems to be a negative statement about something Judean over against something that's more broadly Israelite. And so there are all these nuances that our terminology of Jewish and Christian obscure, because those terms don't have the same meanings now that they did then.
Yeah. Well, that's the perfect segue to probably like the most controversial question that I'm going to ask you today. And that has to do with the modern nation state of Israel. And like, obviously my show is mostly about biblical studies. I interview like political philosophers and economists and stuff like that, because I'm very interested in that as well. But I try not to get involved in politics with like my biblical scholars guests. But I think this is relevant. And the reason why it's relevant is obviously everyone knows what's going on with Israel in the Middle East. And I've noticed a problem. And this is particularly annoying with like libertarians, that, people that have a political philosophy that are similar to me. We're supposed to be individualist, but there's almost this sense that a lot of people have just intrinsically connected what it means to be Jewish with the political entity that is Israel in the Middle East. And so one of the things that I've seen a lot is that as people have become more and more disaffected by the foreign policy of the Israeli government, especially their treatment of the Palestinians, that has been attributed to Jewish identity. Now, like, again, people with my political philosophy should be able to distinguish between the state and the people. That's like fundamental. But there are a lot of people that can't do that with Judaism for whatever. And there are a lot of like Christians that have the same beliefs as me that say, well, this is just kind of baked into the cake with Judaism. That's just the way it's got to be. And I'm like, no, it's not. And I posted something on Twitter a couple of months ago where I was like, hey, like Jesus was a Jew, Paul was a Jew, John was a Jew. So we shouldn't just assume that whatever the modern nation state of Israel is doing is representative of Judaism in any meaningful sense. And I got a ton of pushback for that too. And I was kind of shocked at how many people push back at that. So I guess there are a couple different aspects of this question. Number one, how is that association between Judaism and the modern nation state of Israel kind of maybe kind of poison the conversation about Judaism? And how do we or even can we disentangle how we think about Judaism from Israel as a political entity?
Yeah, thank you. And it's a great question, and it's a crucial question, right? It's not an easy question, and it's a challenging one to tackle, but a lot of the blanket, unqualified, sort of no limit support for the modern nation of Israel, you'll get people justifying that by quoting things from the Bible, right? Whoever blesses, I will bless whoever blesses you, and things like that. And it's like, okay, and here too is one of those places where I think that actual attention to the Bible and biblical scholarship can bring things in, right? I mean, if blessing Abraham meant you can't criticize a king or the nation for what they're doing, then you got to throw out a lot of the prophets, right? You got to throw out maybe all of them, right? Not quite all of them. Some of them are, but there's a lot of criticism of national policy. There's criticism of injustice, things like that. And there's criticism of, disobeying the law. And the law includes things like, the foreigner among you must be treated as the native born and things like that, right? And if you can't criticize the people of God, however understood, for not being true to the texts that they say are scripture, then you can't say anything about religion at all, right? I mean, that's part of religious speech historically. Within Christianity, right? We've had reform movements, it's often been, there are these whole sections of scripture that we're ignoring, right? And things like that. And so I think it's crucial to emphasize that not only is it possible to be pro-Jewish and to disagree with and criticize things that are being done by a modern nation, but it's not inherently different than if you have, let's say, nobody would probably make this comparison, and yet I think it's crucial to do so. If you criticize what, let's say, the British government or the British monarchy is doing, you are not inherently anti-Anglican.
Right.
You might still value the Episcopal tradition and its music and its religion and all the people who are part of it in general, and yet you can criticize British foreign policy or British governmentalism law, whatever, right? And we're really talking about the same thing, right? Criticizing a nation and its policies does not mean you are attacking a people. the reason why this becomes fraught, and why it becomes complex and entangled in these ways is that on the one hand, there are some, there's certainly some Jewish voices who will say that, if you criticize the nation of Israel, you're criticizing Judaism, right? And so that certainly, if you hear that coming from a Jewish voice, you might assume that that's the Jewish perspective, which of course it's not. It is a Jewish perspective, but it's not the Jewish perspective. The other thing, right, and this is closely connected with what's happening there, right? I mean, because if you ask, how can a nation do what it's been doing there, right? What we're seeing is, essentially, what we might perhaps best describe as intergenerational trauma, right, and the legacy of that, right? I mean, the nation Israel, the modern nation Israel, is formed out of territories that, on territory that had belonged to Israelites in the past, but which had changed hands and had other people living there. Always some Jewish presence, but diversity of people down the ages, and different political entities sort of being the imperial power in charge. And then you have, just at the same time as you have this height of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and things like that in Europe, you have the decline and the departure of colonial powers from a lot of their historic holdings. And so you get this moment in which a nation is created, right, in this territory that can be a homeland for the Jewish people right at a moment when they need such a thing. And yet you also have this vision of being a democracy, right? And that's where some of this tension comes in, is that if you get into conflicts with the neighboring countries, and you end up taking over these territories that hadn't been apportioned in the initial agreement, stuff like that happens, right? But then if you keep the people in limbo, right, and as not citizens and don't integrate them, then there's an inherent tension with your claiming to be a democratic country, right? And yet if you incorporate them, what happens to this being a safe place for the Jewish people when you might end up with a majority that's not Jewish, right? And so you have these, and so you have this unsolvable problem, as it were, that is, not going to go away, and it's entangled with all the decisions and the policies and the things that people make, right? And I remember visiting Hebron, which is a place that's in the occupied territories, and so it's but one where there's particularly, a lot of tension, right, between settlers and local Arab population, things like that. And I remember seeing graffiti when I visited there that said "Gas the Arabs," and I was like, what we see here is these two different ways of responding to being a victim of atrocities, right? The slogan, right, that came up after the Holocaust was "Never again," right? And for some, what that means is we have to create a world in which nothing like this ever happens again to anyone.
Yeah.
And the other reaction is we have to do whatever it takes to make sure that nothing like this is ever done to us again.
Yeah.
Right? And when you take that latter approach, then you might be willing to commit atrocities if you feel like, well, the alternative is being the victim and, letting them stamp us out. They tried before, and so we have to, And so, unless we get into the details of the history, right, which, again, many of the people who are involved in the policymaking are aware of this history.
Right.
Even people who aren't have inherited, views of religious others within their own society, within the occupied territories, across boundary walls and things like that, that reflect this history and the trauma, that was inflicted upon this people. And there's really no way to understand what's been happening, or to try to approach it in a nuanced way that lends support to Jews and understands that trauma and is empathetic, while also offering criticism of policies and of actions that are quite horrific. This is just yet another example of how understanding the history is crucial in the present, right? There's no way you can navigate this when you don't even understand, like, not just what's behind it, but how it feels, right, to those who are involved. And so I think, but to come back to the question that, and hopefully I didn't get too far afield from it.
That was great.
But I think we do, it's possible to be, absolutely pro-Jewish and critical of things that are done by a nation, even if that nation is, one that is predominantly Jewish, right? I think we can criticize any nation, and hopefully, particularly living where I do and in the country that I do, I hope that I will not, that people can still like me, even if they don't like what my government is doing.
Right. Yeah.
That is my hope. And I think it's the only hope for any of us.
Yeah. Well, and that is the irony that the people that, spend their entire life complaining about Joe Biden or Donald Trump, they would never consider themselves anti-American, but somehow we can't make that intellectual transfer to Israel. But it just goes to your point that Judeophobia, when left unchecked, has real consequences. And obviously I'm a Protestant. I believe in the authority of Scripture. I believe that we have like a responsibility to try to get the Bible right. So yes, like having unclear thinking about what Judaism is and how it works in the Bible, yeah, it does negatively impact our interpretation of the Bible, but it also has a real tangible negative impact on actual human beings in the real world. It's more than just an academic exercise. There are real people that suffer if we don't get these questions right. And I think that to come back to the point that you made at the very end of what you were saying before, like education really is the only way out. Doing what we're doing today, understanding that these questions are much more complicated than people have often given them credit for, and doing our due diligence to try to understand how these dynamics work. I think that's the only way that we're going to get through it. And so, as we get ready to come to a close today, I guess the last big question that I have for you is, how do we, those of us that want to be more nuanced and critical and sympathetic and historical in our understanding of Judaism and how it works on many different levels, how do we go about convincing other people or helping other people to better understand the complexities of these issues and maybe be a little bit more sympathetic?
Yeah. And so I think there are two aspects of it, right? To the extent that you're interested in the New Testament, then reading things about Jewish history, there are biographies of the Herods and books about them, and don't necessarily need to read them expecting to like them. Not everybody who is around in their time liked them either, but understanding when you understand the political, the cultural, other aspects of the context, it makes these texts come alive in all kinds of important ways, and definitely want to encourage that. On the other hand, understanding today, hopefully the answer to the previous question indicated that there's a whole lot of history and there's a whole lot of baggage that if you as a Christian are thinking about things, you're not reading the New Testament texts the way that the earliest readers would have read them, right? There's all this history of interpretation, there are changes in culture, there's scientific knowledge, there are political things going on, there are technologies that weren't available, and there's no clear-cut answer to what you should do with your smartphone in light of what it says in Proverbs or something like that. And so I think that reading more history, reading about your own history can help a lot of the time. Reading about your history and how it intersected with others, right? If some of the things that we were talking about, some of the historical events are unfamiliar, there are things you can read that will give you a chance to find out about them from a Jewish perspective, from a Christian perspective, but also from a sort of a historian's perspective, just trying to get the details right. And then often, actually, reading things by theologians, engaging with these texts and with the history, but also recognizing that they need to say something that speaks to the present day and may need to say something that's not exactly what anyone said before. I think sometimes that too is helpful to make you realize that there's this distinction between sort of what the texts meant in their own context, and there may be multiple things that they could have meant in their own context, but that's different from the range of things that we might feel we want to do in conversation with them in relation to our own time, facing some problems that are not exactly identical to ones that were there in the past. And so sometimes I imagine that reading a bit of theology sometimes can help you realize, oh, yeah, doing this thing is a different thing than trying to situate Paul or the Gospel of John in its context.
Yeah, well, and that's a perfect segue to the last question I want to ask you, and that's just about the resources that you would recommend for people that want to learn more about this. The problem is, and you've spent your entire life studying this and researching this and writing books on it, so you're a lot more familiar with literature than I am. But if you go to Amazon or Google or whatever, and you type in Jesus and Judaism or Paul and Judaism, there are a million different books and articles, and for someone who's not initiated, because I kind of know my way around the world, so I kind of know what I'm looking for when I go and search this stuff out. But for people who are like, they're interested in this but casual observers, it can be downright overwhelming, and you really don't have any idea where to start. So for people that want to learn more about this issue, what are some resources that you would recommend that might help them think a little more clearly about Judaism?
Oh, yeah, and there too, is it contemporary Judaism?
Right.
There are some things written by, I mean, getting a popular level book written for non-Jews by, say, a Jewish rabbi oftentimes will give you, keeping in mind that you could get something similar, like What is Christianity? And if you're a Protestant and it's written by somebody who's Orthodox, you might read that and say, I'm not sure this person speaks for my own, sort of distinctive tradition and so on. And so recognizing that there isn't a Judaism any more than there's a Christianity, right? There are varieties of it, has to be part of it. But I mean, I'm trying. I'm actually I've been trying to glance at my bookshelf and think. I've been thinking about this. Books on the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are, reading them themselves are this primary text that are just, probably so many things are fragmentary, other things, but reading something about the Essenes, thought to be the group that produced them, there's some disagreement on that. So if that's not your view, then you can still find another book that will work. But something about that group, right? Find out what a group was like in Jesus' time. There are books about, I mean, Anthony Saldarini's book is probably a bit too much, detailed history and answering too many scholarly questions. But there are books about like the Pharisees as a movement. In fact, there was a book, an Erdman's book about the Pharisees, not that long ago, that had some really great authors contributed to it. And so that's probably a good one. There are authors like D.S. Russell. This is going back, several decades now, but who've written about like apocalyptic and sort of the movements in that time, where you realize that the kind of literature that Christians produced and the kinds of expectations they had were not unique to them, right? They may have had a unique form because of the Jesus-centeredness of them, but they were in conversation with and were reflected some wider trends and things like that. Books on Galilee, books on archaeology. There's a great book. I'm trying to remember, was it James Strange had a book on Sepphoris, right? This city that most people have never heard of because not mentioned in the New Testament, but it's very close to Nazareth. Right, and so it gives you sort of a picture of what it was like. It's overwhelming. There's a lot there. I felt like when I saw that you wanted to answer that, and I was like, I have no idea what I'm going to say. But I think, to the extent that you're interested in this, just getting something that sort of will give you the sort of surface level lay of the land, give you a bit of an introduction, Judaism in the time of Jesus, but something recent, that reflects these current trends, because there was a lot of tendency in the past. For instance, you go back 100 years and they were reading rabbinic literature as though it's the context of the New Testament, when in fact these texts may develop out of, sort of religious currents that were there in Jesus' time, but this is later literature. Reading something that's explicitly about, sort of Jesus in his Jewish context, but reading something, take a look at, what is something that's by somebody who's well respected as a scholar of Judaism, a scholar of the New Testament, because there are lots of things out there that are written by, maybe written by somebody who doesn't actually, have anything other than a real axe to grind, on Amazon. And so, and I will say that, I'm happy if this is too vague and broad. I am happy for anyone who's looking for something specific, like to dig into some aspect of, let's say, Jewish literature from just before the time of Jesus or the history, to hear from people. Send me an email or get in touch with me via my blog or social media, and happy to provide some suggestions, tailored as much as possible to what people are looking for.
Right. Yeah, well, perfect. Well, Dr. McGrath, I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate you coming on the show today. I think this is such an important conversation, and I know that my audience is going to get a lot out of this. Before I let you go today, you've published a lot of books. We've talked about two of them. I've had you on to discuss two of them on the show before. Yeah, I saw, because I have Ehrman sending me an advanced copy. You have another one coming up on deconstruction, which looks incredible, and I'm excited to read that. So you got a lot of work out there. So where can people find you, follow you, and find your work?
Well, fortunately, I don't know how I managed to pull it off, but I've managed to be religion prof, sort of like at religion prof on Twitter and on Facebook, and that's my blog and other things. My blog started out being me exploring my sci-fi interests, and so it used to be called Exploring Our Matrix. And when I realized that my students don't know the Matrix films anymore, I decided, okay, this needs a new name. And I'd been religion prof, I think, on Twitter for a while, and discovered that was still available in other places. And so, I'm even active on Reddit. The academic biblical subreddit is actually quite a good place for getting scholars, and most of them are anonymous, but they've sort of shared their credentials with the mods there. I'm there as well, and so there are plenty of places. Just type in religion prof, all one word, and there's a reasonable chance that you'll find me.
Yeah, well, Dr. McGrath, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Alex. It's always a pleasure talking to you.